But we'll wait a little bit longer. In the meantime, can I remind you of those of you who haven't, the poll, yeah, the Google survey thing for deciding on the final slot. We've had 9 responses so far, but we could do with a few more. So that's in the chat if you haven't already got it. And here comes Elvira. Good morning, good afternoon.
Hello, hello, good morning.
Good morning. And yeah. So let me just open also the schedule to remind us of where we're going, where we've been. So this is session 6. And one more scheduled session and then the open slot. And as I say, I've dropped the link to this survey, if you haven't done it, into the chat. Hi, Carrie. Good morning,
Hi.
Fabio.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you, Carrie? Beautiful day.
They just turned the heat up, haven't they?
Yes.
It's like from one day to the next. It's like,
I know, it's gone up several notches.
Yeah. I'm not complaining, I like it.
Good morning, Fabio. Are you?
Good morning. Yeah, I'm not on silent mode today.
Okay, good. I miss your dulcet Australian.
Thanks.
And here's Girish. Good morning. Good afternoon, Girish. Good evening, even.
Hi. Good evening.
Okay, so let's get going. As I said before, we've got a couple of absentees, so we're not as big a group. That's the problem. We'll go straight. I think we'll go straight into the reading discussion. I've got a couple of questions here, which I will copy. Well, questions that kind of. Oh, by the way, yes, I thought you might be interested in this. This Tim Murphy, who's the co-editor of the book, our book, sent me this the other day, which is a picture of Earl Stevick. I don't know where or when, but it's one I've never seen before. So I thought that's kind of nice. I'm sharing that with you. And that's the reading. And some of you have had a chance to look at the video, which is great. I just thought we might spend some of the discussion clearing up some of these terminology issues that are introduced by Larson Freeman in her article, or techniques, of course, being an invention of Stevick himself. So if we can spend a little bit of time in the breakout room discussing, clarifying, if you've got any doubts, voice them and then bring them back to the plenary if you can't resolve them in your session. So I'll just post those into the chat. And you can copy that, take it with you. And then, of course, discuss any other issues that arose that you found interesting in the reading or challenging or whatever, and we'll bring them back to the main room. And then I've got a bit of a presentation if we have time for it. If not, I'll record it and send it out to you. So unless there's any questions or comments, we'll go straight into breakouts. How many are we? 13, 12. So let's create 4 rooms. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, who's just arrived? A blue convolved. Oh, Ruthie. Okay, good. Good afternoon, Ruth. We're just about to go into rooms. So I've made 4. Here we go. Right. How are we? How did you get on?
Yeah, we had a couple of questions about tech names.
Was not
and-
easy. Yeah.
Yeah, tech names and emic versus etic. Those were the 3 challenging terms for us.
Yes, because unless you understand the emic or emic, or your emic versus etic or emic versus etic distinction, then this notion of techneme doesn't make a lot of sense. I think if you think of phonemes and phonetics, and that's where we kind of get this from, that, phonetics is the description and the study of all the sounds in all possible languages. So, the International Phonetic Alphabet, when you look at it, it's huge. I mean, it's displayed on a chart, but there's 150 or more characters in there. And that's meant to represent all the possible permutations. And even then, it doesn't really include all the things like the different clicks in click languages, etc. But that's the idea, that it's meant to. And then there's a subset of those sounds which are used in specific languages, and some will use more and some will use fewer. And those are not, so the phonetic alphabet is, as I say, it's the view from outside. The view from inside, if you speak a particular language, you will recognize some of those sounds, and others will be, you won't have them, or you won't recognize them, or you won't make the same kind of distinction. So that's the view from inside. So that's the emic view, the view from the user, yeah, as opposed to the view from the researcher or the external authority or the, So the view from inside is the emic one. And so what the idea behind technemes is that it's a technique which has relevance. It's meaningful to the learner. The learner can see, oh, this is like, I'm being asked to do something different here, or this is different from that activity. It's like B in English is different from P to an English speaker, but not necessarily to a speaker of Arabic, for example, who doesn't make that distinction. You see what I mean? So it's the user's view of the learner's view, in this case, of a technique that the teacher uses as being distinguishable from another technique, kind of thing. And I think we sometimes forget how important it is, the user's view, the learner's view. They haven't been trained on a CELTA course or a Delta course. They don't necessarily have a very sophisticated knowledge of methodology or understand why we're doing things. And maybe we should tell them more often why we're doing things. And this relates to a further point, I think, that Diane Larson-Freeman made, and I think one of those articles that James accessed, which was that we might also need to tell them how they transfer, give them advice as to how to transfer the classroom activities into the real world, or, that's all about this adaptations thing, that they don't necessarily know how to do it on their own. And maybe, but we'll come back to that issue in a minute. So is that clearer, Fabio?
Yeah, the challenge is what does that mean in practice?
Yeah, okay, exactly. And I want to take you through an example in a minute, but I think some of them have already come up actually in the forum. In fact, you, Fabio, posted that that slide from the demand high course. If anybody hasn't seen that, it's worth looking at, because that's like 20,000 things you can do with one technique, which the technique was, I can't remember what was, identify the error in a sentence. There's lots of different things you can do with that basic idea. You could ask them, you go further questions like, is this a big error? Is it a bad error? Is it a spelling error? Is it a pronunciation error, et cetera, et cetera? You can keep asking lots and lots of questions. And I think that's, again, the point about Stevik's thing, that there's not just, I mean, it's not just one technique for one learning object. There's lots of techniques, lots of variations of a technique. And the more you do, perhaps the more you're likely to hit that particular learner's kind of, we were talking about in the group I was visiting, their zone of proximal development, where they are, you know, on their learning trajectory. Not all learners will be in the same place, which is another argument for having a rich variety of activities in the classroom, because some of them will under-challenge some learners and some of them will over-challenge others. But with any luck, if you've got a diverse class, and all classes are diverse actually by definition, but with any luck, the more of these activities you do, the more chance you have of hitting the zone, yeah, for each individual student.
And the less materials we need.
Well, I mean, I think there's a tendency, and I'll make this point too later on. There's a tendency to rush through materials through fear, either through fear of boring the students, so we'll just read this text quickly and then we'll move on, or because there's a lot to cover to get through the syllabus in time for the exam, kind of thing. So, you know, it's always very interesting comparing how fast individual teachers move through course books. I remember discovering this as a relatively new teacher in the school I was teaching at, and you would be comparing notes with other teachers who are teaching the same level. And you know, others like, I'm still on page 3, and I'm on page 63. And it's often the newer teachers feel that they've got to go through every activity in the book, whereas the more experienced ones know what to cut out. But at the same time, it may be that some teachers are actually dwelling on these activities and exercises and texts and that, and really working them hard, rather than just skimming through. So, you know, it's a juggling act, you know, how much, but you're right that perhaps we could do more with less. And that there's always a good exercise on a training course is, okay, here is that little text. How many, you know, think of 12 different things you can, I'll come back to that point in a minute. Yeah, let's put, yeah. Any other terminological issues?
I also had time with complex systems, you know, how they can be applied. That was a bit challenging for me while reading.
Yes, Elvira. Well, this is Diane Larson Freeman's kind of hobby horse. I mean, she, in a sense, introduced the notion of complexity theory and chaos theory, and they're kind of related, or dynamic systems, etc., into the discourse of applied linguistics in an article that she wrote in 1997 or something. And she's been writing about it ever since, and in fact co-wrote a book on the subject. And it's not easy. It's not easy, but basically the thesis is that language, like other systems in nature, is a complex, evolving, dynamic system. It's not a fixed, stable system. So language, both in the way it's used, is constantly changing. Well, we know that because how people spoke in Shakespeare's day is very different than how they speak now and write. So we know that language is changing, actually often much faster than we realize. But we also know that in individuals, in their first language, the language is constantly changing as it moves nearer towards the target. And it's changing in ways which are not necessarily linear, in the sense that, you know, even a child learning, if its first language is English, they're not working their way through the grammar, as it were, in a kind of linear fashion. There's often sort of 2 steps forward and 1 step back kind of thing. And we see that in our learners too, learning a second language. So the idea that language is not an incremental, linear, kind of logical system of rules, etc., is really what she's getting at. That it's an emergent phenomenon for a start. It kind of emerges not through the application of rules necessarily, but it emerges through use. That's the other thing that is very much tied to complexity theory, the notion of what's now called usage-based theories of acquisition, which see language acquisition both first and second as being as not running according to some kind of set timetable, but being very much influenced by the opportunities that are available in the environment, the linguistic environment, not just in the classroom, but outside the classroom too. James.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that in that when trying to put students in different courses, for example, trying to place them, one thing that the actual proficiency guidelines offers is the difference between partial control and sustained control in, say, a piece of grammar or a lexical field or something, which the CEF doesn't really pick up. And I think it's a very helpful way to gauge the emergence of a piece of language, to see how the control by the student, from the student's point of view, how much control they have over it at a certain point in time.
Exactly. And in fact, as part of, it's not actually complexity theory, but I think it fits in. It's more to do sociocultural learning. Now, sociocultural learning, if you remember that kind of Vygotsky in model, that you learn through interaction, basically through scaffolded interaction. So your first language through your caregivers, through your siblings, etc., in the classroom with the teacher and other students, etc. But really, it's all about the idea of the zone of proximal development is that learning is best effected in that at that point where the learner is almost able to do the task on their own, but need some kind of assistance. There's the degree of assistance, coming back to James' point, which is perhaps a good marker of where they are, how much control they have over the activity that they're learning. And so one way of testing that is what's called dynamic assessment. Dynamic assessment is not finding out what students know, what they can do unassisted, but how they respond to assistance. So dynamic assessment, just to give you a very brief idea, would have, say, a list of responses that an examiner would provide to see how quickly a learner can correct themselves on an error, for example. So if the learner says something like, yesterday I go to the beach, a very non-specific prompt for self-correction might be, what? Yeah, showing, just I'm not going to tell you that even you made a mistake, but there's something there that is not 100% satisfactory. And if the student can then immediately say, oh, sorry, I went to the beach, you can see that they are practically there, yeah? But if you've got to go through a whole lot of questions right down to, I think you're talking about the past, and in the past, we use the past tense, and the past tense of go is went. And then the student goes, oh yeah, okay, yeah, yesterday I went to the beach. Well, you can see that they're a lot further away from this degree of control than the student who can immediately self-correct. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's what you were talking about, James, but that's what triggered that association in my mind. So it is about the degree of control that the learner has. And this relates very much also to the degree of control, to whether they can control something enough to extrapolate that knowledge into the outside world, which is really what Diane Larson-Freeman's really on about. So what can we do in the classroom which moves students closer to being able to function autonomously and without the teacher or the other learners in the real world? And because we know this is what is meant by the inert knowledge thing, that inert knowledge, if it's inert in the classroom, it's going to be inert outside the classroom. And one one way that language remains inert is because when it's just taught simply declaratively, yeah, declarative knowledge is knowledge. I know that the past of go is went, but unless I can proceduralize that, then it's not much use to me, that information. I won't have time for a start to access that rule when I'm in full flight. So it's analogous. It comes from skill learning theory. You know, learning to drive, you know that there's 5 gears or something, and you go from 1 to 2 to 3, 4. But until you actually proceduralize that, until that procedure becomes automatic, then you're not fit to go onto the open highway.
Scott,
And so this is.
can I ask you something?
Yeah, Cecilia.
You think this all to become automatized? Sorry. Do you think beginner students can do that? Because I think they would struggle, right? Because I remember having an experimental class during my MA. The professor was teaching Hungarian for us, have no knowledge. And through discovery learning. So, and for me, it was very difficult to understand anything because she didn't, on purpose, right? She didn't teach the rules. And I was going crazy because I wanted to know the rules. So I'm just wondering if this, if you think this affects beginner students.
Yeah, I mean, that's why they're beginner students, I guess, because they're not ready for the open highway. But I think, you know, I guess one of the problems here, I'm just thinking maybe in that case that you mentioned, what learners wanting rules, maybe because they, it's chaotic. It's not even complex. I mean, the system that they're trying to get their head around. And I think one of the dangers of a monolingual approach in the classroom, i.e. English only or Hungarian only or whatever, is that it complicates things rather than simplifies things. And that it would be better, I think we've talked about this, that you have a more multilingual classroom where students are being able to express themselves in their first language. So they don't feel completely incoherent. And then the teacher supports them by providing the means to do that. But that skill of translanguaging, if you're code switching, is what they also need in the outside world. And I mean, so, you know, even a beginner, we all know this. We've all been in a situation with a language in a foreign country where we've never studied the language. All we have is a phrase book or a dictionary. But we have to get a certain thing because we forgot it. I remember trying to find, you know, in Japan or somewhere, trying to buy a contact lens fluid. You know, I mean, it's not the first word. It's not a very common expression. It's not something a teacher could ever anticipate you would need, but I needed it. And so what do? You become very resourceful as using bits of several languages plus mime, plus, you know, whatever to get your meaning across. And I think we need to kind of perhaps teach those skills, those communicative skills in the classroom and come, were we talking about this last week, or the idea of the teacher being a coach rather than a,
Talked about it.
Yeah. And I think it came up today in the forum. I was answering Fabio, I think, your post.
I think Sinem was mentioning that in the psychodrama.
Exactly, yes. The idea of the teacher leading from behind for a start. So they're not, this is all to do with control, but being there. And then coaching from the sidelines also, as an analogy with the football coach or whatever, so that you are, but anyway, that doesn't really answer your question, Cecilia. I think,
Great,
I think, yeah, it does come back also as a different learner types, and some learners want rules and the declarative knowledge, and they'll never proceduralize a few expressions that they're picking up. It also comes back to this thing about memorization of chunks. You know, that can be a really useful foothold into real language use. I mean, I think, again, we've all done this when we've been a total beginner in a new context. I remember back when I first arrived in Egypt, somebody wrote for me on a on a post-it note 5 expressions to use in a taxi. You know, go left, go right, go straight ahead, stop. And that was liberating because it meant that I could become an autonomous user of the ecology of Cairo. I could go out there and I could get home again. And it was just those few expressions. Any other questions related to things that you found problematic before I launch in? And I just want to recap some points that I noticed as I moved around. And I guess, let me start this presentation because we might not get through it all, but it raises where is it? It raises some of these issues, and I think coming back to Fabio's question about the practical applications, I think she's not. She's not great on the practical applications. Because that wasn't her brief. Here we go. And she was writing not for an academic audience, but perhaps not an audience of teachers necessarily. Whoops. Okay, so, well, Steve, those are the terms. This is an interesting book, incidentally, and I think it sort of makes a lot of sense. It's not one of his better known books, but it's a book for teachers. And the key is in the word options. It's all the different options. He never uses the word technemes in this book. The book came out in 1986 or something. Incidentally, I don't know any of you remember or ever came across the writings of Wilga Rivers. Wilga Rivers was an Australian, born in Australia, but she worked in the States at the University of Harvard as an educationist and writer on EFL. And she bridged the transition from audiolingualism into the communicative approach. And she did it very gracefully in several editions of one of her key books, which is this one, Practical Guide to the Teaching of English. So Wilga Rivers, she was Stevick's generation. She was a very important methodologist. And I found this book in a secondhand bookshop in Boston, and it was, along with lots of other of her books signed by her. So clearly somebody had, after she died, they cleaned out her library. But anyway, that's a footnote, nothing to do with what, so what it is, as it says there, it's a series of exercises to do in a training context. And teachers work their way through them. And basically it's to raise their awareness about all the different choices and alternatives that are available for any particular curriculum goal. Essentially it's about practice. But you can see that there's, this connects very much with that techneme article that Diane Larson Freeman references. So for example, he has here, he's looking at, he takes a page from a course book, a current course book, and he looks at all the activities in it. And he says, you have various options. One option is whether the students should reproduce exactly the language that was given in the sample in the textbook. Should they try to reproduce it exactly, or should they put it into their own words, that kind of thing. And he looks at both those options from the point of view of kind of learning theory. And generally he comes out in favor of, use as many options as possible. But I think it's a kind of interesting in the light of that article. And so what I did, I just want to share this with you. I have a teacher training course I'm working with at the moment of teachers who are working mainly with refugees in Jordan and Lebanon. and we had a session on Tuesday, and I thought, I'm going to run with this idea of technemes, particularly in relation to dialogue. And if you looked at the original article by Stevik, and in fact, you don't have to, because Diane Larson Friedman mentions it in her article, that one of the things he looked at is, he uses an example as what you can do with a dialogue. So I took a dialogue from a course book, current course book, which is Touchstone in this case. You don't have to read the dialogue. And then we kind of brainstormed, first of all, the sequence of stages that you might go through with any dialogue. So you either expose learners to it or you create one from scratch. Then there's some kind of practice of it, performance of it, and then some kind of adaptation or transformation. At least that's what I was suggesting. But if you take each of those stages, so for example, the exposure stage, you've got, again, a number of options. They could listen to it, or they could read it, or they could listen to it and then read it, or they could read it and then listen to it, or they could listen to it and read it at the same time. And then they could reconstruct it from memory. I mean, that would be another option. They could look at the picture. Yeah, so going back to they could look at the picture and try and predict on the basis of what clues there are on this picture, what these two people, what their relationship is, and what they might be talking about, since it's over around the water cooler. Let's imagine it's a Monday morning. Yeah, so they can then predict the and then compare it to the course book dialogue. Or they could, this should have been first really, because it's the more traditional, they could just listen to each line of the dialogue and repeat it. But even then there's options. They could repeat it individually. They could repeat it under their breath, subvocalize it. They could repeat it in chorus, etc. And they could repeat it cumulatively. So each time each line is played, they go back to the beginning and keep repeating from the beginning, or they could repeat each line individually, etc. So again, those are, and then the practice options might include, again, chorusing it, practicing in open pairs, like across the class, while the others listen, or in closed pairs, or in the breakout room or whatever. And all these options with or without the text. And again, Stevik mentions these in his as being sets of options. And then the performance stage, if this is what you think is worth doing, having the students perform, can be done to their immediate group, say in the breakout room, or to the whole class. It can be recorded on camera, etc., etc. So there's, again, different options there. And of course, you can see that within this, there are gradations of task difficulty. So it's easier to do a performance when you're not being watched by a lot of people in your privacy of your group. It's slightly more stressful to do it standing up in front of the class, but perhaps even more stressful to do it and be recorded at the same time. Now, when I say stressful, I'm talking about what's called facilitative stress here. You know, this kind of stress that makes you perform to the limits of your competence, rather than debilitative stress, which makes you underperform because you're nervous and anxious, kind of thing. So again, coming back to the idea of technemes, it's the gradation of these different levels of task difficulty that I think is captured by the idea of a techneme. And then finally, how do you, having done that, what could you do to adapt the activity? And then you could extend it. Let's imagine they keep talking about the weekend. So you could change the register. So they're not colleagues, but one is the boss, for example. Yeah, or one of them's a new worker, who, etc. And so, or you could change the situation from not Monday, but Friday. So not talking about what happened last weekend, but what they're planning for the next week. So all sorts of things you can change. And of course, you can personalize and say, okay, now we've listened to Tom and Jessica talking about their weekend. Let's go and do a dialogue, write one or rehearse one, perform one, which is your weekend. We said, the point is really, is once you do this, you realize that there's just a limitless combination of choices available. Hence, the challenge really for the teacher is deciding which, how to steer a route through all these different options. And that where the techneme idea comes in. The techneme, remember, it's from the learner's point of view that this is a technique and activity that's kind of new and challenging and useful. This is where they might need to be enlisted, their opinion. So what would you like to do now? We've done the dialogue, you've learned it by heart, you've memorized it, so what would you like to do with it now? Would you like to perform it? Okay. Would you like to film it? Okay. Would you like to adapt it? Okay. So we don't have time to do this, but I mean, it came up, I think, again, in reference to that slide that Fabio posted in the forum of all the different things you can do with a very simple coursebook exercise, which is to correct a mistake. But if you're presenting vocabulary, for example, I think something we've already mentioned this, there's so many different things you can do, even with a finite list of vocabulary items like this. There's 20,000 things you could do even with that picture. You could beam it up for 5 seconds, then take it away and see if students could remember how many things they can remember, and so on. I like doing things in real classrooms with cards. So all these words are on cards. If you imagine like this, all cut up, and there's lots of things you can do manipulating those cards. Like, for example, look at those words there. Tell me which ones were not in the picture. There's 15 there, I think, and there's 12 and so on. Or that having eliminated the ones that are not, then all sorts of things you can do, ranging from the relatively cognitively unchallenging to the much more cognitively challenging. So again, this is where the gradation of tasks comes in. How do we put these things in order? How do we know what's the optimal order for doing things? So one way would be to use this principle of cognitive depth. The deeper, the more processing that's involved, the further down they go in terms of the so the first activity is relatively simple: eliminate 3 words that weren't in the picture. Then put the words in their original order. So again, there's not a focus on meaning so much. It's just retrieving or recalling the words, which is good, but it's not the whole story. And again, a focus on form, group the words into 1 or 2 syllables. So they're moving these cards around as they work in pairs, groups, find words that rhyme, shirt, skirt, for example. And then now we're moving into slightly more cognitively deeper activity, group the words into at least 3 categories. Yeah. So these are the words, if you remember, in the second box, put them into 3. You decide the categories. Yeah. So the learners, again, working together, decide. Now we're moving into slightly more situated learning. Imagine you lost all your bags, should be after a flight. Make a shopping list of the clothes you would buy in the order of importance. Yeah, and they have to do this together in pairs or 3s and agree on a definitive list. So each time they do these tasks, of course, they're going to be using these words again and again, retrieving them, having to check, hang on, what was a skirt? What was a shirt? And then write sentences about people in the class using these words, compare sentences, yeah, so that we're going into a much more creative. So nothing here that you're unfamiliar with, I'm sure, but it's just to reinforce this view that there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to teach a list of words. And you wouldn't necessarily do these same techniques with every list of words. This just happens to be a list of related words which lend themselves to these kind of activities. Are there any questions or comments on that before we look at task repetition?
That was all very cognitive, but what about the emotional or affective side of it as well?
Absolutely. Exactly. So, and that's where Stevic would say, yeah, cognitive depth is one thing, but affective depth or emotional depth is also very important, particularly with learning vocabulary, I mean, learning anything, but learning vocabulary. So maybe there needs to be a task there, group the words into things that you like and things that you don't like. words that you like the sound of and words you don't like the sound of. Talk about your favorite shirt, skirt, pair of socks, or whatever, and so on. Absolutely. Thank you, James. But it doesn't answer the question. Okay, they've learnt these words and they've manipulated them and they've retrieved them endlessly. They've engaged with them within the classroom. There's a reasonable chance that they've, we could say, learnt them. But how does that knowledge become more than just inert knowledge? How we can transfer it or transform it into the real world? And this is, I think, the most interesting part of Diane Larson Freeman's, the implications of what she's on about. So if I just can continue here. And she says in one of the articles that James retrieved, this notion of transfer appropriate processing. We need to learn things in a way that allows or optimizes the chance of it being transferable, which is where proceduralization and automatization comes in, of course. It is important for students to engage in activities that are rich with affordances and that have psychological authenticity. So the rich with affordances thing is what I was talking about in one group I visited just now, the difference between what I call a narrow, this is why I had narrow on the brain, a narrow band syllabus and a broadband syllabus. So a narrow band syllabus is one which is based around a number of discrete grammatical items, typically. So, you know, it's today's Tuesday, we're going to do the present perfect continuous kind of thing. Irrespective of whether learners are ready for it or have learned it before or whatever. So there's not much, it's not rich in affordances, whereas it may be in a class of 20 students, that one thing will be appropriate for 2. Whereas a broadband syllabus would be one where the syllabus objectives are expressed in larger kind of terms, like a whole task, talking about your experience. For one to go back to James's example. I remember, I watched a class once with I was assessing a teacher on a Delta course, and he was teaching a group of beginners and doing the language of daily routine. So basically it was a present simple daily routine kind of lesson. And he had included, I mean, it's a great lesson. It was very, very well executed and planned, etc. And he even had found time at the end of the lesson to include a short retrospection on the lesson. He'd given them a questionnaire. I imagine it was in Spanish. I can't remember because they were beginners. But so what, did you like the lesson? What activities did you like? Would you not like? And one question he had was, what was the lesson about? And when the students had all filed out and I was with the teacher, we were looking at the results of the questionnaire, and unsurprisingly, the learners had liked the lesson. But what was really interesting was their different interpretations of what the lesson was about. Most of them were on, either identified the notional area, like habits, routines, etc., because it was all about I get up at 5 and I go to work and blah, blah, blah. And or some of them had identified the grammatical focus, which is the present simple. So yeah, fine. But one of them had said, and answered the question, what is the lesson about? She said prepositions. Prepositions. And Seamus and I looked and said, but it wasn't about prepositions. It was about the present simple. And then we thought, well, actually, there were a lot of prepositions in it. I get up at 5 and go to work by bus, etc. Now, why did that learner notice the prepositions and not the present simple? And this is the interesting thing. You would need to go back and find out more about her. But perhaps was because for her, the present simple was not interesting, or she'd done it before, or was maybe beyond her grasp. But the thing that she really felt that she needed or was relevant was prepositions. And of course, prepositions are endlessly problematic in any language. And so she decided the lesson was about prepositions rather than anything else. And, you know, does it matter? That was the point, because this comes back to this thing about rich and affordances. For her, the affordances were the prepositions. So what we want, of course, is language. We want classroom language that is wall to wall with affordances. It needs to be very rich and not very narrow and very constraining for this kind of thing to happen. Now, this notion of psychological authenticity I want to look at now. You know, what does it mean? And it actually comes from an article that was written quite some time ago by these Canadian researchers who were sort of in the early stages of the communicative approach, realizing that communicative activities per se are not necessarily focused enough for learners to get the benefit from them. Just talk to your neighbor about the weekend is too vague and too broad. At the same time, drilling learners in sentences like, what did you do at the weekend? Did you have a nice weekend, etc., doesn't necessarily give them the means to be creative. So it's trying to, how do you get learners to be creative, but at the same time automatic, fluent, because that's what fluency really is. It's the ability to produce language without too much thought. It's automatized. So they came up, and this is based on research. They came up with 5 recommendations for activities in the classroom. And one is that they should be genuinely communicative. And this, by that, they mean not just interactive, but that there's some kind of processing of the message. I mean, students can be talking to each other, but not listening to each other. So communication, I think, is different from interaction in that sense. Communication requires listening and requires processing before you respond, kind of thing. So activities should be communicative, not just because that's nice, but because when you're actually communicating, you are forced to be a little bit more automatic than when you are just mindlessly reading through a dialogue or memorizing a dialogue, for example. So the paper conversation activity, which I've shared with you endlessly, where students are just texting each other but writing, is an example of real communication. But it's not necessarily constrained in any way. Benefit they get from this is the feedback that they get from the teacher. Because it's written, it's easier to give feedback to students in this kind of activity than when they're just simply speaking. So that's the real plus of it. And they can, of course, do this using electronic or digital means as well. The second, and this is where they bring in the expression psychologically authentic. What they mean, they define this, that activity should be designed to allow learners to experience some of the normal psychological pressures felt by people engaged in real communication. That is to say, when we communicate in the real world, there are different psychological pressures perhaps than in the classroom. And one of the criticisms of, say, humanistic language teaching in its kind of laid back sense, like Suggestopedia, listen to this soft music and imagine you're in blah, blah, etc., is that it doesn't really create the more stressful situations that we're often in when we have to produce language in real time and we have to react to other people producing language in real time. What one writer called working in real operating conditions. And this is by analogy with people, for example, pilots. When they train pilots, they have to simulate what it's like to fly a plane in all sorts of conditions. They can't put the pilot in the plane and just sit by him because that's too risky. So they create simulators, etc. But as near as damn it, what they're trying to do in the simulator is create real operating conditions. But arguably, these are not real because still the psychological thing, you're not actually flying a real plane. So, there's always going to be that little bit of transfer gap. But what they're saying is so one way of doing this is to either recreate the outside world in the classroom, but that's not easy. Or in the case of this project, it's to take learners out of the classroom into the real world. So again, forgive me, I've talked about this before, but the Language Learning in the Wild project is a fantastic idea developed by a number of institutions in Scandinavia, where people go to learn a Scandinavian language like Swedish or Icelandic or whatever, and so they have classroom instruction, but the classroom instruction is in preparation for a real world task. So they go out into the real world, in this case, to buy some pastry, and they're filmed by their classmates doing the task. They take photos of stuff, the affordances, the linguistic affordances in the bakery, and then they bring these back to the class for kind of debriefing, and then they might prepare again on the basis of that to go and do the same or a similar task, iteration in the outside world. And it's described here quite nicely. It's been a subject of a lot of research, what goes on in these interactions. By the way, the people in the shops, etc., are primed to play along, not to switch automatically to English, for example, which would be the tendency normally when the foreigner comes in and doesn't speak Icelandic. So learners are first prepared, they prepared for interactions in real life service encounters, prepared in the classroom, participated in the encounters, they were video recorded, and later reflect on their classroom experience back in the classroom. So this really does bring the two, the classroom into the world and back into the classroom. But of course, it's not feasible in most EFL contexts. But I share it with you nevertheless, because I think it's one obvious way of recreating or creating the conditions of psychological authenticity. In the real classroom, it might just mean getting students to do tasks under increasing conditions of complexity or pressure. And we'll look at that in a second, how task repetition. But instead of just doing a task sitting down, doing it standing up. Instead of doing it with your friends in the breakout room, do it to the whole class. Then they go on, I won't dwell on this. There are 5 criteria that activities should be focused. The definition of this is they should be based around basic functions and notions, not just some kind of grammatical structure that's being recycled. And that they be formulaic. Now, this is something they kind of foresaw way back in 1988, that the formulaic use of language it's both idiomatic. We use formulaic language to sound more idiomatic, but also it gives us a more leverage in terms of processing. If you could produce a formulaic expression as a chunk, then it could save time that might be spent on trying to create that chunk from individual words. And of course, now we know from corpus linguistics what common formulae are. These are some of the most common combinations of ever, according to the Coca corpus. The verbs that most, or the expressions in whichever most commonly, the 4-word expressions in whichever most commonly occurs in order. Coming back to James's present perfect lesson. So if we can include some of these expressions in our activity, practice them in advance. And of course, we can practice them in advance through activities like this, the famous one of us, two of us, all of us, none of us, can, into groups, generate as many sentences as you can using this pattern, and then tell the class what your sentences, etc., because you can adapt that to any specific grammatical structure. And so that's a way of pre-practicing, generating chunks using, which are personalized nevertheless. And then finally, finally, inherently repetitive, that these chunks need to be repeated. And this leads us into this whole question of task repetition too, as well. Although here they're talking about mainly it's the individual items that need to be repeated in this activity. So the activity should be structured so that these chunks get a fair amount of repetition. And that's where the automaticity comes in. So your classic activity, which ticks all these boxes, might be the find someone who activity. So today we're going to have a class survey. You've got to find the person in the class who is the most traveled. The traveler of the year in the class. So devise some questions which will inevitably mean using the present perfect at some point. Have you ever? Or you could be more or less explicit about them using that. So, and that's formulaic. It's focused because it's on experience. It's genuinely communicative because they've got to process the answers that they hear. It's inherently repetitive because they're going to go around the class asking all the students. And to a certain extent, you could say it's psychologically authentic because they're standing up and moving around. So it's happening in real time. And then just finally, as an example of that, this comes from Zoltan Dernier's psychology book. It's a big read, I'm afraid, but he just described some experiment where that's exactly what they do, Taguchi, using dialogues, coming back to our friend, the dialogue, and integrating chunks into the dialogue. So I'll just let you read that. So what the researcher was focusing on, it was to try and raise, what it is a challenge. How do you teach chunks, And so this was a way of teaching them and contextualizing them. But arguably, because they were learning chunks, they're also becoming more automatic and also you could. It raises some questions of what's missing here because you would need another stage to then do the adaptation stage to be creative, to create a new dialogue based on this one using the chunks. But at least this is the first stage. I'm going to just stop now and see if there's any. I'm conscious that you've been chatting away and I've been completely oblivious. But I'll save the chat and revisit it and see if there's anything that we can incorporate in the post-session discussion. Anybody want to raise any questions or add to anything that I've said so far? I know for some of you, you'll be very familiar with this. But I do like those 5 criteria. They make a lot of sense to me. You'll never find an activity that's going to tick all 5 boxes necessarily. That's a tall order, but it also lends support to the techneme kind of choice of technemes that you could, if those are the criteria for choosing the technemes, that they're formulaic, that will then involve a degree of repetition and so on, then we may be on the right track. And no course book is going to make all those suggestions for you necessarily, or be working according to the same criteria.
In the original article that James shared with us, thank you, James, he mentions, Stivik mentions that the teachers themselves should go through this process of techniques. And I think that's crucial really to, if we are to open new ways for students to do it, we should go through those ourselves, right? And, you know, encourage them in the in-service or pre-service courses that we offer. Yeah, just a point.
Exactly. And I think, again, not enough is done, in my experience, at least, on training courses, either pre-service or in-service, to and help trainee teachers develop or extend their repertoire of techniques, or to take a basic technique like correction, for example, and say, what are all the different ways you can, here's an error, I go to the beach yesterday, how many different ways could we respond to that error? And what would the effect, what might the effect be? Just to widen the repertoire that teachers have, so they've got more techniques. And then, you know, and then encourage them in their practicum to go out and try them. And I think actually this is as important for, if not more important, for experienced teachers than new teachers. Experienced teachers tend to, we get our routines and we stick to them. And it's sometimes quite good to say, let's just change, the way I ask questions. I mean, coming back to one of my obsessions, let's ask more real questions and fewer display questions, for example. See what the effect might be, both how it feels to us, but also how the students respond and so on. Yeah, good point, Margaret.
Can I ask you something, Scott?
Certainly.
Going back to the 5 aspects, right, of activities. You mentioned one, which is something pressure. I forgot.
Psychological authenticity, was it?
No, it was pressure. Did somebody, am I crazy? Did I?
No, it was focused, no pressure.
That was psychological pressure. So under
Psychological.
real operating
No.
conditions, so to speak.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I remember you mentioned pressure, and it said that in order to become more fluent, students need to feel some sort, some level of ease, right? They should feel comfortable, right? I don't know. How should we deal with that? How much comfortable or at ease should they be in order to become more fluent, and in opposed to this psychological pressure, which I understand, but I'm kind of confused.
Well, again, I think within the classroom, obviously we don't want students to be so pressured that it becomes a negative experience, and that's often what traditional language learning was all about, because the focus on accuracy and on speed too. I mean, I don't know if any of you have heard of the Callan method. The Callan method was a kind of still around, a way of teaching which relies on very, very fast-paced drills, repetition drills. And so the idea is that the learners don't have time to think or translate in their first language, from their first language, etc. But I remember talking to a woman who did 2 weeks at the Callan school in London, and she said she had nightmares at night. She was drilling in her sleep, and then but then she said she got used to it. She kind of started to get into it, and it became a challenge, but it became a pleasant challenge, and she actually didn't mind it at all. For her, it was working. So again, we have to. These stories are very important to take on account. We think we know what good methodology is, but then something like fast drilling, which we thought had been discredited, is found to be quite effective for some students. But coming back to your question about pressure, the other extreme, opposite extreme, is the reaction to the audio-lingual approach and all that drilling and the language laboratory and the decontextualized sentences, etc. was one of the reactions away from that was the humanistic movement in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, to which Stevic was very, very committed. He is grounded in humanistic principles. But he's the first one to say, but humanism doesn't mean a lack of control. That's come up in the forum. It just means more student initiative. But the control is still there from the teacher. The teacher is the support, the scaffolder, etc. It's not that the teacher abdicates their responsibility. It's just in the net to make, but nor is it necessary that we go easy on correction or we go easy on accuracy. Because, you know, I mean, I think this is the one interpretation of humanistic teaching, which is probably even some of its strongest proponents, like Adrian Underhill, would probably disagree with that. It's all about students being completely blissed out, yeah, because that's not good preparation for good language use. But so again, you know, we don't want them to be. It comes back to these two kinds of stress: the debilitative stress that debilitates you, weakens you, it makes you underperform because you're anxious, and the facilitative stress, which makes you outperform your current competence. And we see students who do that suddenly amazing in an exam or something. They, oh my God, people are telling me that they've seen one of the differences between online learning and class-to-class learning is that sometimes it allows some students to actually shine who wouldn't normally shine in a classroom context, which is interesting. So we need, it's about calibrating that pressure, yeah? Just raising it by little degrees. This comes back again to the technique thing. You don't go from, you know, using the analogy of gear changing in a car, you don't go from first gear to fourth gear. You have to go through the gears, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're raising the bar, which is the next part of the presentation I was going to give you on task repetition, but I know you're probably familiar with it. But the idea, coming back to Diane Larson-Freeman's point, that it's about iteration, you know, repeating tasks, but making slight changes in the repetition. And as I was saying in one of the groups I visited, I used to do this. My philosophy for doing this was to change an element in it. We know that repeating a task is good. All the research evidence suggests that if you repeat a task, there are gains in terms of fluency and or accuracy and or linguistic complexity and lexical range. Each time a student does a task, they're a little bit better at it. We know that. Every time I do a talk, I'm always a little bit better at it than the time before, until I start getting lazy and then suddenly something happens and I wasn't prepared for, etc. So it's all about automaticity, but also it's not just getting more fluent, it's also getting the language that gets more complex, etc., more accurate. How do we get students to repeat doing a task, though, when they see it, oh, we've done this, we just did it, why should I do it again? So that's, we've got to, you know, so how, that's the, where we have to get ingenious, and that's where the techniques come in. How can we change the task so the students don't really realize that they're doing it again? And one way is, of course, you can change the person they're talking to. So you keep them moving around, yeah? You can change the time that they've got to do it in. You can change the medium. So what they might have done as a writing task, they now do as a speaking task. You know, the paper conversation, we've done it writing, now you have to do it speaking. You can change the audience, you know, from group to the whole class, etc. You can change all sorts of things. That was the point of the second thing. Now, so I always thought changing the task was a way of keeping it from getting boring. But reading Diane Larson-Freeman, I realized, no, it's also a way of for them to learn to adapt the task for a different context. So I'm going to tell you about my family, then I'm going to tell Elvira about my family. But when I'm telling Elvira, she's going to ask different questions. I'm going to have to adapt, etc., than if I was telling Cecilia, for example, etc. So it's all about adaptation, adaptation, adaptation. The idea is that if we do this enough, then students are better prepared to transfer that knowledge, not knowledge so much, but those skills into a real world context.
Yeah, and I liked that in the text, she talks about the output of a task being the input for the next one, right? So I think that's really relevant. And it gives both the teacher and the students a sense of, we know where we're going, kind of thing.
Absolutely. So you could design a whole, you know, course based on that cycle of kind of using the output of one task as the input for the next kind of thing. Yeah. You just posted, Cecilia, I noticed, was that the link to me talking about repetition, was it? Is it?
Yeah, it's a webinar by Cambridge University
Ah,
Press, I
okay.
think.
Okay, yeah. Good, excellent. Yes, no, I mean, I keep repeating myself. Have you noticed?
It's an excellent webinar, Scott. I've recommended it a lot.
There's nothing new under the sun. That's the thing. But I mean, but there is, you see, because I've always said that, you know, task repetition was all about keeping it interesting for the students. But now I realize, isn't that amazing? Rereading this article by Diane Larson and the associated articles that James kindly supplied, and an article in this book, Learning Language Through Task Repetition. It's a whole book of research papers. And guess who's got an article in here? Here she is again. I mean, you can't keep her down. Diane Larson Freeman. Task repetition or task iteration. And then she said, that's the name of the title. It does make a difference. So, but as I reread her, rereading is a form of task repetition, I find new things each time. And if there's, I will do that, Cecilia. It's not easy reading. I'll share, it's not easy reading. It's because she goes up a notch because she's talking to academics and she's repetitive or reiterative. Okay, folks, well, listen, we'll never get through it all, but I think, you know, we've demolished that article pretty thoroughly. I look forward to joining you next week, and we look at Leo Van Leer, the late lamented Leo Van Leer, and I'll tell you a little bit about my acquaintance with Leo on control and initiative. So and the dynamics of agency. So agency, control, and initiative. We're recircling, coming back to some of the issues that came up right at the beginning in the very first article about agency, etc. It's a nice short article. So hopefully you, Margaret, do you have the book yet? Okay, I'll scan it. It's a nice short one, so it won't take me long to scan. It won't take you long to read.
Yeah, Amazon Turk wasn't the best option, really.
No. Oh, we live and learn. We live and learn. That's what repetition is all about too, living and learning. Listen, I could talk to you all. Elvira.
Can I ask a quick question? It has nothing to do with the course. It's, I think, more like private language question. How many languages do you speak, Scott?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, what do you mean? How fluently?
Yes. What languages you are fluent?
One. And then I speak Spanish. My Spanish learning experience and using experiences, I think I shared the connection with my blog, my defossilization blog.
I'd like to show you.
Sorry.
So that's, you can find that, actually Cecilia might be able to find the link. My defossilization just describes, and my level is about, hovers between B2 and C1. So, but I wouldn't call that fluent. But do you have a reason for asking?
Yeah, because I also try to learn new languages, and being a teacher myself, it's so hard to find a good teacher for a new language, you know, because when you have your own way of teaching and go to different courses, for me, it's impossible to find a good teacher.
Absolutely.
We're the worst students, aren't we?
I totally agree. We're spoiled as teachers. We're terrible students because we're so narrow-minded, and I find it very hard. And I think the only way that I'll ever learn to get better at a language is to do one-to-one. Actually, that's not true. I enjoy classrooms. I enjoy classrooms for what they allow you to get away with, but I can't transfer. And one of the things, going back to this thing of transferring, was when I did intensive Spanish classes here, which I describe, I came out of the classroom and into the street, and I was equally fluent in both. I was able to, because it was the psychological thing, if I can do it in there, I can do it out here. And whereas previously, I've said this before, where people used to cross the street to avoid me, I would cross the street to talk to them. And I identify with people like Wes, for example, that case study of Dick Schmitz in Japan, who achieved a degree of communicative ability. But again, very contextually situated. Depends who you're talking to, about what, when, what time of day, how much you've had to drink, all those kinds of things. So no, I'm not a polyglot like many of you I know are. I envy that capacity that you have, not only to learn lots of languages, but to learn them so well that you sound like a native speaker, in the case of Fabio, for example, or James, I'm assuming. But we could talk about this a lot, and maybe we will. So don't forget to just help me decide what to do on session 8. We've got the 2 more sessions coming up. As I say, next session tends to revisit some of the stuff that we've been looking at, and maybe we'll have a bit more space to talk about language learning experiences. Okay, folks, lovely to see you all again, and we'll see you next week, same time, same place.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.